I think, you know, jury nullification is one of those things that is, you know, it scares people, it's dangerous, it has all sorts, it's fraught with all sorts of complications. You can see jury nullification working really well in one context and really horribly in another context. And so it's a proposition that, you know, could potentially go very, very wrong. But the reality is you're not going to stop it anyway. I mean, what happens really is jurors go into a jury room with their own conscience and their own experience and their own sense of what justice is. And more often than not, these days, they compromise, which is its own little weird subset of nullification. It's like they don't, you know what I mean? It's like they get in there and there's 8 counts. And at the end of the day, they're sort of like, look, we can't agree on these counts. Let's just compromise on this thing, which is not really what they're supposed to do. It's not nullification, but it's also not following the letter of the law as the judge gives it to them. The juries will, in some ways, you know, come up with their best solution for what they've seen in front of them. Now look, jury nullification has some very powerful possibilities when a community feels as if something has gone terribly wrong in the criminal justice system and they object on political, moral, religious, or other grounds as a consensus in a community to something that's going on in the criminal justice system, and they may just refuse to convict. That's a defender's dream, right? Is that my defender's dream is that everybody goes into a jury from here on in, and please do, on any drug case that comes into a system and you're sitting on a jury, and you just convince those jurors not to convict because the system is wrong. The war on drugs is wrong. How drugs have been used to put communities of color and poor people in prison is wrong, and you refuse to be a part of it. Look, that is a very interesting, legitimate form of protest that I think, you know, people will engage in the jury system. You know, the downside to it is you can imagine it happening in ways that would, you know, horrify me. You know,
and it has.
And it has, right? So it's a very complicated thing, but there aren't a lot of ways that communities have, and juries are drawn from the community, right, that they're sitting in. There aren't many ways for community members to actually have a voice, to really raise their voice and protest about some things. And I think jury nullification sometimes is one of those tools that they can use to actually let that be known to prosecutors usually. And so in that context, obviously, I think it has interesting possibilities as a mechanism of protest.
You know, I agree that juries certainly compromise often enough. I would argue that they tend to compromise, I think, in principled ways. I mean, yes, there's some times when, you know, it's the holidays coming up, and then they say, well, you know, some of you say he's not guilty of anything, we think he's guilty of murder, so we'll convict him of, you know, criminally negligent homicide. By and large, I think those cases are rare. I think when yes, juries compromise, but they compromise in ways that I think a principled person would say, you know what, that is a reasoned approach to justice in this case. And yes, look, Robin's also right about another thing. No matter what you tell juries, one way or the other, sometimes they're going to nullify. And I'm gratified that, by and large, juries do not engage in jury nullification. Not to say that juries always convict when I would convict. I think sometimes they acquit when I would convict. But they do it for very legitimate reasons. And look, and let's make explicit, you know, the reason why judges should not tell juries that they have the right. Oh, I'll also say this: a professor, I believe, at Yale Law School, or someone at Yale Law School, wrote in the Yale Law Journal a scholarly essay saying that juries should acquit acquit African American males in all drug cases. Okay, I mean, I find that an outrageous proposition. Just as I found it outrageous when my friend and colleague Robin said it just now. But you know what? Why was I not alarmed? Because no one listens to her. So, no, because, I mean, she could say that over and over. But you know what? When people go into that jury room and the judge has charged them, and I'm telling you, you know, I've been in the criminal justice system for a little while before I had my first trial. And, you know, the criminal justice, I mean, too much of the criminal justice system looks like a bazaar, you know, particularly if you're not initiated to it. It looks, people are shouting things, and you don't understand why they're going up and why they're, I mean, I saw this just, you know, I'm kind of at the level now where I'm not in court very much, and so when I go back, it's almost like the first time. So I go back, I'm sitting in the audience waiting for my case to be called. They call the name of the case, like, you know, John Smithers. Okay, so John Smithers stands up and starts to walk towards the front of the courtroom. The court officers turn to him and say, sit down, right? And John Smithers goes back and sits down, right? And I'm thinking to myself, what, you know, presumably, if Robin's doing his job, he's probably had a lot of these cases and gotten off, but I mean, one way or another, you say, what What view of the world does this poor man have? When someone calls out his name, John Smithers, he stands up, and the first word out, sit down, as though you've done something wrong. So look, you know, so that's the kind of bizarre, the kind of Casbah that it first looks like when you walk into the criminal justice system in New York, not in federal court, in state court. But the first time I saw a trial, it was completely different. I was doing the trial, but I mean, it's deliberate. There's a certain majesty of it. The judge wears the robe, and at that point, when that jury goes back into the room to deliberate, they have forgotten that Robin told them that they should disregard the law and just do what she tells them to do. They're going to do their best to follow the law.
Are you allowed to say that?
Of course not. He's making that up. No. You can't stand up and say disregard the law. I'd be helping. There's some judge would start screaming at me. Not that would deter me, but I would be screamed at and admonished.
Didn't you say they should acquit in every drug case?
No, I just said it here. I don't get my jury to say it. No, I'm educating this group of people. And if you're not persuaded by the scholars or the Paul Butler's work, or you're not persuaded by me, then go to the website and look up what David Simon, who wrote and produced and created The Wire, did after he got done doing all his research for The Wire and shooting The Wire in Baltimore, who called for exactly the same thing. So if you're persuaded by popular culture,
but let's say this. Let's just make explicit what Robin was saying earlier. What is the horrors? Because this has to be faced too. The horrors of jury nullification. Emmett Till. How many people recognize the name Emmett Till, please? Oh, thank heavens. Okay, you don't know John Rawls. I forgive you. Emmett Till's uncle. Emmett Till, young African-American man visiting his uncle in Mississippi, whistled at a white woman, or may have flirted with her, and some men came to his uncle's house, asked for him, took him out, beat him, then I think they gouged his eye out, put a weight around his neck and threw him in the Tallahatchie River. They were arrested and put on trial, and the defense at trial was that the body was too brutalized for the mother to do an effective body identification, and perhaps Emmett Till was really still alive. That was the defense. The jury acquitted. And the jurors later, at least some of the jurors who gave interviews to the press, admitted that they knew that the defendants were guilty, but just felt that it was unjust to punish them for what they had done. That's a great example of jury nullification and why it's a dangerous thing. And you know, throughout the Jim Crow South, there were lynchings where people. Well, the Four Little Girls, a wonderful film by Spike Lee about the Birmingham church bombing, there was a trial in that case for, I think, Dynamite Bob was the name of the person who placed the dynamite near the church that had caused the deaths. Acquitted of murder, convicted of possession of dynamite. So again, jury nullification can be a terrible thing.
And it can be a legitimate form of protest.
Well, at the same time, well, we have about 10 minutes left, so I see a lot of questions, and I'm trying to everyone, but first, you.
So I'd like to go back to the war on drugs, and I'm really interested in the way that the war on drugs has been expanding into legitimated medical spaces. So we're seeing a lot of hype around prescription drug misuse.
A lot of what?
Hype around prescription drug misuse.
And what's that like? I don't know that.
Hype.
Prescription drug
Oh, hype around. Hype around. Oh, you're not enunciating.
Hype around. I thought it was like hype around.
Enunciate. Hype around.
It's a new term.
Got it.
So I'm curious about how that's been playing out on the ground, because
That's a great question.
We know that the war on drugs is resulting in a lot of inequalities, and I'm curious about if you're seeing similar things with prescription drug misuse.
Great question. I'm very impressed with your audience, and you guys should be the debaters and not me anyway. So can I tackle that, because we're doing a lot of work on that? Can I?
Sure. Go right ahead.
I think you really have put your finger on one of the biggest issues in the criminal justice system now, and one that I think you're right to relate to. I hate the expression war on drugs. I guess in part because Richard Nixon thought it up. But look, right now, the leading cause of accidental death in the United States is overdose of prescription opioids. And it is now, more people die through an overdose of prescription drugs than die from heroin and cocaine combined. More people every year now die from prescription drug overdose than died of AIDS at the height of the AIDS crisis. This is one of the biggest public health problems. And forget the people who die for a moment. The people who are addicted, whose lives are just destroyed by prescription drug abuse. Just overwhelming. And I have to say that I don't think it's largely hype. I think it's something that society really has to find a way to address. And now time out for my commercial. The reason why I think you framed the question exactly the right way is, look, for a long time people, I mean, look, if I ever go to a cocktail, I don't get invited to many cocktail parties, but when I do, I know what's going to happen. They line up, and everyone says, don't you think it's time to legalize drugs, you know? And
I want to go to those cocktails.
and
I get, how can you defend those people? I don't know where you go. But
they still do that?
Yeah, people still do it.
All right. To which the long answer is, look, if you want to look for a model of legalization, and there's this notion, gee, if we legalized it and we had doctors dispensing these drugs or medical professionals dispensing these drugs, if we got people the services they needed, then yes, these drugs are a terrible thing, but at least we'd be controlling them. We're not controlling prescription drugs, which are manufactured in armed facilities, literally armed facilities that are computer controlled from the moment they leave the factory until the moment they get to your house. And, I mean, a doctor came and lectured to us and told us that there was a huge study, which was what made it impressive, was statistically, it was just an enormous study where they did random urinalysis of people who had been prescribed prescription opioids. And some huge percentage, I'm going to say it was something like 60% of them, had no evidence of opioids in their urine, which meant that they had not taken the drugs that were prescribed to them. Now, maybe they didn't fulfill the prescription, but what happens in a lot of cases is those drugs are diverted. And look, and is there violence associated with it? I don't know if you read the papers in New York. There was a terrible massacre at a pharmacy in Long Island that was, in fact, it was frankly a spin-off of a case that we're now prosecuting, of someone who had gotten prescriptions for these drugs, could no longer afford them, and went into a pharmacy with a gun and blew people away. The last homicide case that I brought with me, when I was a homicide prosecutor for many years, and then I went over to the Special Narcotics Prosecutor Office, I brought one case with me. That case was a bludgeoning death of a man who had been a drugstore owner, and the person who bludgeoned him to death was one of his suppliers in the prescription drug diversion. And that wasn't even primarily opioids. I don't know if you're aware of it, but there's a black market in non-opioid drugs just because there's a huge profit to be made. What it means is you may go to a legitimate-seeming drugstore and buy a non-opioid drug, arthritis medication, and it turns out that that drug has been diverted into and out of the black market, which means that I once saw a Dateline hidden camera exclusive where they had a criminal who was counting the pills, sneezed in her hand, and kept counting the pills. It means that you don't know if the dosage is right. You don't know if the drugs are contaminated or if they've expired. You don't even know really if they're the right pills that you're taking. And once in a while, as in the case I prosecuted, someone dies. So I guess what I'm saying is that even if we were to legalize drugs, even if society were to take that huge and tragic step, what I think is terribly, terribly wrong, there will always be a role for criminal prosecution. Because if this is any evidence, no matter how tightly you control those drugs, there will be people who will find a profit motive to go around the law. And look, I mean, do we really want to have a day in New York City where it's legal to buy crack cocaine on the street, but illegal to buy a 20-ounce spray?
That's an inside New York.
It's an inside New York.
That's a New York joke.
I have a friend who's
That's a Bloombergism from this week.
I have a friend who used to be the head writer for Saturday Night Live, and I'm on the train. I said, I'm going to try this joke. What do you think? He said, they won't know that it was from New York. They won't laugh. And it was right.
Well, so I think this raises a really interesting question, and I'm really glad that Peter sort of walked right into it, which is if in fact you take him at his word, and I don't know the statistics about prescription drugs being, the biggest drug scourge that this country's ever seen, and more people die of it than heroin or crack or anything else combined, and this is the greatest drug problem that this nation has ever seen, one wonders why there isn't hysteria and a war on these drugs. And I might venture to say that when you close your eyes and you try to imagine People that go to doctors and get prescriptions and have access to doctors, and where those prescriptions wind up, and who's trading and giving and borrowing and exchanging their Ritalin, Ativan, Valium, Oxycontin, whatever the things are, what do those people look like in your mind? And who are they? What? They look like you. They look like you, and they look like me, and they look like Princeton students, right? They look like Princeton students, right? If what you really want to do, if what you were really going to do is have a war on prescription drugs, you would go to college campuses across this country, and you would begin to go, and look, the heads are nodding, because everybody has watched that exchange, right? Everybody. The Ritalin exchange, the Percocet exchange, the Valium exchange, whatever it is. By the way, every exchange, whether it's money exchange or not, is a sale, by the way, okay? So it's interesting to me, and it really raises a great point, which is, if this is a real problem, why are our resources going into arresting people for pot and crack, right? And people who don't have access to doctors and prescription drugs, and why aren't the resources going into what he has described as the greatest drug problem this country has? So I say, bring on the police and the Princeton.
I'll tell you. Listen, if you go to Washington State or Florida, where there are huge problems, there were huge problems, and I think there continue to be huge problems in diversion, doctors there will tell you, I'm no longer prescribing opioids. And that's becoming a big problem too. There are doctors who say, what happened was in Washington State in particular, they came up with what I think are very reasonable laws, so that doctors have to have training, doctors are limited in what they can prescribe, the circumstances under which they can prescribe, so that they're not going to just prescribe to an addict to keep them taking their drugs. And so what some doctors are saying is, now I'm scared of being prosecuted for a crime, I'm not going to prescribe those drugs anymore. They would tell you, if you went to a medical conference in Washington State and you said, where's the hysteria about prescription drugs? They would tell you, are you kidding? That's all there is hysteria. Okay, so...
they tell you the hysteria is about methamphetamines, which is basically being cooked in poor people's kitchens and out in the hinterlands.
No. It's things that what doctors are saying is
and that is being targeted.
They're putting me out of business. People, and look, I'm not apologizing. I mean, I think the laws are by and large pretty reasonable in response to. I mean, there were the number of deaths. Well, anyway.
Yeah, but Peter, these drugs you're talking about are legal. They're just the legality of it is being misused, right? They are legal.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So you could make the same argument, right? That what you're supposed to be cutting down on is the abuse, but you're not. Nobody's making them illegal. They're making them legal if you have the right means to get access to them. If you were to take the drugs I'm talking about and legalize them and regulate them and tax them and create revenue sources and reasonable ways to get access to drugs, people could probably do that in a way. And
you're right. Then maybe we could
crack down on the abuse as well.
Maybe we could increase the death rates from those so that they would match prescription drugs.
One thing I think that has to be addressed that hasn't really been addressed is just the profitability of judicial bias. Being that you mentioned earlier in your first definition of the goals of the criminal justice system is to protect the large community and while maintaining the rights of the individual. But one thing
that's not what my version
or,
was. That's what the definition was in the dictionary.
You said that was incorrect. I think it's actually dead on, but it's just there needs to be an asterisk at the expense of a minority so that the majority can be good. Because really, if you look at a state like Louisiana, in which it has 7 times the incarceration rate as China, they have 76% blacks that are in their prisons. So now you have a necessity for people to constantly be feeding into these private prisons, which we have a global privatization of prisons, especially in the United States with the corporate corps of America or something like that. So really, I mean, I think that there's really this kind of this silence, like, oh, we're not going to talk about the prescription drugs in this area because we need to focus on the poor community to keep them feeding into while we have, our Princeton graduates coming out to become these judges to further arraign these poors that are keep constantly feeding into. So it's kind of a feedback loop that's been kind of, I'm not saying it's intentionally done, but it's just what has happened. And it's kind of where we stand. I don't think that really the proposition of having this judicial bias has really been discussed because, I mean, when you start talking about people's money, then you have problems. So.
Indeed.
I just wanted to get your opinions on like really how you feel.
I'll bet another thing we agree about is that I think private prisons are a terrible idea exactly for the reason that you state. I mean, they're like, well, for those reasons and more. I mean, they're like any private business. Frankly, even state facilities, they become an important part of source of revenue for some localities, and there's oftentimes resistance to shutting them down, even as the prison population declines. That having been said, and remember, thank heavens, New York has really come a long way in dropping its prison and jail populations, which is good news. You know, when I was at Princeton, there was a African-American psychology professor named Curtis Banks, who said something which obviously made an impression on me because I remember it word for word now, 35 years later. He said, when a judge tells me I have nothing against this man, I believe him. But he said, the difference is that if a white defendant came before that same judge, the judge might be more inclined to understand the reasons why that defendant committed that crime than across racial sentencing. Believe me, I really don't think that most judges in New York are overtly racist or biased or prejudiced. But I also think that Kurt Bank was saying something that's true of all of us as human beings, that to the extent that we immediately identify with someone before us, we're more apt to see their behavior as the product of their motivations and their circumstances. If someone we see as different from us, then we come to other conclusions. So I don't think judges are disobeying the law or going out of their way to be harsh or are, in the classic sense of the term, racist, by and large, at all. But, you know, it always sounds like I'm fawning over Robin, but she deserves to be fawned over. I mean,
does it sound like that to you? It doesn't sound like that, right? You're not mistaken that you've been fawning over it all the time.
Well, I'm about to
fawn a
fawn.
little bit. I'm good with that.
Here's why what she does is so important. She has a different, you know, this word holistic, it's an overused word. What does it mean in this context? Here's what it means. It means she's going to make an effort when the defendant goes before a judge. And look, it doesn't even have to be cross-racial. I mean, it could be an African-American judge sitting with an African-American defendant before, but the African-American judge has had a different experience in life that makes him say, hey, I was on the straight and narrow, I studied hard, I worked hard, why can't you? What Robin says is, if I can tell that judge enough about, number one, who that defendant is, how that defendant happened to commit that terrible crime, if in fact the defendant's pleading guilty or has been convicted. And one more thing, if I can tell the judge, or assure the judge, if you show leniency in this defendant's case, why I can assure you that the defendant will be unlikely to reoffend. Well, then you flip the switch that Kurt Bank was talking about, and then judges are much more inclined to say, oh, I get it, you're not a bad person. I get it. You're somebody who was in a bad circumstance, who made a bad choice, who, given the right circumstances, might not make that bad choice again. And that, I think, is part of what holistic defense, and it helps us as a prosecutor, because anything that enlarges the record, anything that gives us more information on which to base decisions in the criminal justice system, is if you see the criminal justice system as balancing the safety of the community and the rights of the individual, it's only helping us to make better decisions.
I mean, I appreciate the shout out about holistic defense and public defense and how important it is to have places like the Bronx Defenders that really put our heart and soul into defending people who otherwise wouldn't have a defense. But I also completely recognize that we're doing nothing to change the underlying problems that are driving people into the system. And I make no mistake about that. We are putting Band-Aids on gaping wounds. And to the extent that we can help create opportunities for clients, to the extent that we can help their families become more stabilized, to the extent that we can prevent other damage from happening to them because they're coming through the criminal justice system, because make no mistake about it, you come through the criminal justice system, you are damaged. You will be damaged in ways that you will probably never recover from. Your family will be damaged, your communities are being damaged. It's inexcusable. And to the extent that we can stand in front of some of that and prevent some of that damage, we do as holistic defenders, and I'm proud of that, and you know, all of us at the Bronx Defenders have dedicated our careers to that and our hearts and our souls to that. but we're not addressing the underlying problems that racism is rampant in this society. Some of it's conscious, some of it's not. It's, the bias is there. We're not addressing the policing strategies that are going on and who's being shoveled into the criminal justice system and who's not. We're not addressing the issues of poverty, right, that are so intricately connected to the criminal justice system that when you go to small communities that are all white, out in communities in Nevada or other places where I've gone and I've done work with other public defender offices where everybody looks the same, it's the poor folks who are in jail. It's the guys with no teeth and shaved heads who are living in the desert with no running water and no electricity and trying to raise their kids. So that's really what the criminal justice system is, and we're not really making much of an impact in that. We hope to make an impact individually and have some effect and some ability to stop the train of the criminal justice system from really running somebody over completely, but the underlying problems are really, really big. And if you're going to get out there into the world with your Princeton degrees, and they're incredibly valuable, go out there and start tackling some of those bigger issues that really need to be addressed, because the criminal justice system is literally the end game, right? I mean, it starts at the schools, it starts at the elementary schools, it starts with the prison to school pipeline, it starts with having criminalized young kids of color across this country, it starts with schools and teachers calling the police over a schoolyard fight instead of resolving it themselves. That all starts very, very early on, and we're getting it at the tail end, but by the time we see our clients, they've already had 1 million systems fail, they've already been denied access to 1 million of the resources that lots of other people get access to, and by the time a cop brings them to the courthouse steps, there's so much damage that's been done that we're just trying to put, Band-Aids on the wounds. Not to say that it's not a profession you should absolutely go into, and it will enliven you and embolden you and give you more than you ever give it, doing public defense, and change you forever, probably in ways that you can never actually turn back from, and I think that's a good thing. But I make no mistake about the fact that we're just at the end of the problem that started way, way sooner, that needs to be addressed on a much larger level.
And I'll let Peter have the last word for today.
Oh, okay. Let me say, absolutely, and I should say that my current boss, Cyrus Vance Jr., who's district attorney now, has said what I think makes perfect sense. The law in New York is that except under certain limited circumstances, you can't discriminate against someone in an employment decision based on a prior criminal conviction. Well, says Cy Vance, why then should employers have access to that information? If they're not allowed by law to take it into consideration, why aren't we sealing those convictions? And it's a very complicated issue, but it's happily one that is getting a tremendous amount of attention right now in New York. And you understand why that fits in with what Robin was saying, because she's saying, look, okay, maybe the jails and prisons are emptying out relative to what they were 10 or 20 years ago, but you're still giving a person the mark of Cain, the onus of a criminal conviction, and that's going to have secondary repercussions. A tremendous amount of thought, including by the district attorney of New York County, is being given to how we can stop that from happening. I mean, look, in some instances, it's got to have an effect, right? If someone wants to be a bonded accountant, well, of course you can look if they have a conviction for fraud. Of course, absolutely. But there are going to be many instances where someone might be excluded from a job for a reason that by law ought not to be taken into consideration, and so we have to consider how to make that law work. Now, let me say this: the bane of your existence as a prosecutor is you get a lot of phone calls, and I wonder if Robin will agree with me. You get calls from defense attorneys. Most of whom I think probably don't last very long in the criminal justice system because they get frustrated and leave. And the phone call is, "Counselor, my defendant's innocent, how about a misdemeanor?" And they've probably only spoken to their client once.
And none of them ever worked at the Bronx Defenders.
No, I'm sure they didn't. I'm sure you wouldn't hire me. They wouldn't work for you long, I bet. It's unbelievably depressing. Number one is, if you truly believe in your client's innocence, try to convince me that your client is innocent so that I'll dismiss the case. Don't tell me, "Counselor, make an innocent man plead guilty so we can both get rid of this case." And number two is, tell me something about your client. Is he from an intact family? Is he from a broken family? Was he look, here's another thing I bet we agree about. I guarantee almost every time, if not every time, you take a violent criminal, and look, I've spent a lot of my life trying very hard to make sure that violent criminals went to prison, and sometimes for very long periods of time. But I'm telling you, you will find in their life that they were doing great in school till their twin brother died. Or they were doing great in school till their parents sent them to North Carolina and their aunt abused them. Or they were doing great in their life until their dad went to prison, or got out of prison and came back. Not to say that to understand all is to forgive all. In the criminal justice system, we have to make some tragic choices in life. But when Robin is saying that it's a calling to be a defense attorney, that's the kind of defense attorney that it's really a calling to be. And I would argue that similarly, it's a calling to be a prosecutor. And that that's why we have an adversary system, because when it works, we're going to make much better decisions than any of us could on our own.
Thank you, Peter and Robin. And before we adjourn, we'd like to have some words from Jet Staffing.
We've been placing Princeton Project 55 fellows around the country and New York for over 20 years now. And all of those fellows are exposed to seminars. Some in Chicago are held weekly, and in New York they're held monthly, which means that there have been hundreds and hundreds of seminars on the public interest for the benefit of these fellows. In New York, I can say, without question, that the most popular, the most stimulating, the most interesting of those seminars have been the ones that we have held at the District Attorney's Office with Robin Steinberg and Peter and other representatives from the DA's office. So thank you not only for today, but for all the many informative presentations and debates that have enlightened all of us. So thank you.